Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 176, the brand new Digitizers Q&A. Good afternoon, folks, and welcome into the Takeup. I'm going to let you know first and foremost that this is probably going to be a fairly short show and tell you, hey, I am sorry because we had not only the holiday last week, but I have had an incredibly hectic week full of things that I'm not going to share all of the, vagaries of my life. The parasocial relationship is maybe not the best one. You guys don't know me. What you should know is things have been a little tough. Scheduling's been tough. And today has been a little tough. So we have a little bit of a late start, and the likelihood is it's not going to be the fullest show that you might have expected from the end of the day. However, didn't want to let you guys down or let you rest for too many weeks without me being here to answer questions and be there for you. So I wanted to come through and say, let's try and have a Q&A. I'm going to talk about some stuff I've been dealing with, some brand new digitizers. That's why I called that the brand new digitizers Q&A. And we're going to discuss some of the things that new digitizers have trouble with, certainly. And if you have other questions about digitizing, about embroidery that you want to ask, go ahead and hang for the Q&A. Put them in the comments. Even if you're in the replay squad, I would love to see those in the comments so that I can answer those later down the road. If you have a show you need from me that you'd like me to produce, let me know what that topic is and we can get there. But just to let you know, we had an interesting thing this morning, and it came with a picture that is stunning enough that I think the spectacle is kind of interesting. This morning, I ended up with a little bit of a rude awakening with the water turned off in my house, and it's been off all day, as well as other utilities. And it turns out we might have had a water mains leak on the block, and I'm actually going to show you this because I think it's funny. I'm calling to find out whether or not what's going on is a real outage or something's wrong in my house. And just as I wake up early in the morning, I step outside and turn to the left, and I see this. Yeah, I think that might have been a water main leak, and you can definitely ask the guy in the club cab how he felt about it. It took an entirely huge wrecker to haul that thing out of that hole, but I'll just say that pothole probably not going to look real great later on down the road. But if you're wondering why I'm a little frazzled, maybe don't look my best. Well, today has been a bit of a hectic day, and that's on top of, frankly, a bunch of stuff that like I said, not going to share everything in the world. Really rough week, and capped off with a bit of fun as far as the water main outage and our friend in the truck ending up in the largest sinkhole that I've seen, at least personally, and that's only a couple houses up from me. So a little jangly. You hear construction equipment around, that would be why, because they're still in the process of fixing it. So water should be here soon, and hopefully road should be in back and replaced after the fact. So one of our water mains did go out here. And here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, we do tend to do things a little slower than you'd like, but they did get on it, and there's been a lot of equipment rolling. So if you're wondering, when there are sounds, when there are problems, that's what it is. Not an embroidery thing, but I just thought I would let you guys know what's going on and be honest. If you hear slamming or beeping or weirdness in the background, that's what's up. And yeah, a lot of people talking in. Looks like a sinkhole. Absolutely, it was one made by the water main digging out that soil underneath it. Yikes, I agree. Just about sucked the whole truck in. Yes, it did. At least didn't happen during Thanksgiving. I agree entirely. But hey, suffice to say, if I'm a few minutes late, that's why I'm a few minutes late. But let's get back to the topic, right? So here's the thing. I wanted to talk about a lot of different stuff. Suffice it to say, the first kind of few things you may have heard from me before, and I have other episodes talking about it. But the reason I call this the brand new Digitizers Q&A and why I'm kind of calling this something that's related to that absolute brand new person who's just starting out is that though we may have talked about some of this stuff before, I'm actually seeing that brand new digitizers are coming to the table with different problems than they used to. Partially because of the onrush of new technologies. And for some of you who I'm going to say things that I say new technologies and they're going to sound like they've been there forever. And for you and your work, they may have been, but they might be new as far as, let's say, when I came in, which is, over 20 years ago as a digitizer. The things that new digitizers had problems with before compared to what they have problems with now have changed. And so I'm going to talk about that. Also, we have some kind of truisms that we talk about with embroidery where we can point to new digitizers and say, oh, I know what this problem is. I know why you're frustrated. And these things have changed a little bit too, to where even some of the terms that we use, some of the stuff that we tend to blame for problems that digitizers are having or that people are having because they're just starting out, have changed a bit. And there is a new kind of class of these problems that I want to address here. And like I said, honestly, a lot of it's about technology and graphics and drawing and vector art, and these things becoming more accessible, becoming more, honestly, full of assets out in the world. A lot of this is actually an increased level of higher quality assets, leading to misunderstandings and certainly people leaning on things that aren't working out for them. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And like I said, we're not going to have a super long show. If you have questions in any of these realms, or you want to talk about your new experience as a digitizer, or as your experience of working on new parts of the digitizing journey for yourself, I'm absolutely here for it and will answer questions, as many as I can. But expect that some of this might be short, a little bit of retread, but I think that it's important to understand where people are coming from now, because part of the thing I'm seeing is when people are frustrated with their work, that when they're just starting out, some of us who've been around for a while are blaming things for that work, for the problems in their work that is not how they got there, right? And so what I'd like us to think about certainly are a few different things. Number one, that with changing technologies, some of the things we used to blame are not necessarily the problem anymore. Also, I would love for anybody who's here who is within the sound of my voice, if you are helping somebody with a problem and you are not sure what's going on with it, if it's machine based, if it's something else, take a breath, stop for a minute, look over the evidence as if you were a detective or a scientist, and say to yourself, what is the most likely thing? Let's use Occam's razor. The simplest answer is probably right in this case. Things that are overly complicated may not be the case. And don't just throw things out there, because one of the things I'm seeing recently that has been frustrating to me watching brand new digitizers who end up in the court of someone like me who does this education all the time, they'll say, like, I try and ask on social media. I try and ask, I'm on a Reddit thread. I'm in Facebook if you're there. I'm in wherever it is. I'm sharing stuff that I'm working on. And people give me so many answers in so many different places, I can't figure them out. And what I'm often seeing is that well-meaning people who want to help are just throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks. And frankly, a lot of it, if you looked over the person's question twice, if you looked over the images that were provided, frequently is pretty obviously not the problem. There's a certain class of folks where it's like, hey, it's immediately a problem with stabilizer if there's ever anything wrong at all with alignment in an image. Stabilization can have something to do with it, but if the if the design's not puckered, not crushed, if it's shifted in a very particular way that's obvious to be something related to pull compensation, these are things we can tell. If we look at stitches, they're on the same angle, they're meeting at an edge, and there's a gap between them, and the rest of the design looks okay. There's no puckering, no problems. There's a much higher likelihood of this being pull compensation issues because somebody hasn't compensated those two shapes together than it is to necessarily be stabilization, or at the very least, even if stabilizer could be used to help fix by throwing more stabilizer at it. The truth of the matter is, if you're meeting and you're just barely making it because your stabilizer can hold it just together in the plane of your stitch angles on two objects, that may not be the best answer, and they probably need a little more nuanced discussion. There's a lot of folks who are just like, boom, tensions when there's things that have nothing to do with tensions. Or your digitizing's bad when you have vertical looping. The truth of the matter is vertical looping is more likely a tension problem because we can't set any sort of tension on each stitch. If you have randomized vertical looping in a shape, much more likely to be dirty thread path, something in the bobbin area, than it has anything to do with digitizing, short of very, very short, highly densely packed stitches causing some friction. And even then, that kind of looping doesn't at all look like the stuff that I'm seeing people say immediately, man, go get that file fixed. And there's especially a tendency for people who don't digitize to be saying, it's a digitizing problem, go get the file fixed, when there are physical problems. So the best thing for us to do is to stop and say, hey, dealing with a brand new digitizer, give them your experience with something similar, but take a moment to look at the stuff that they're working on. In any case, let's get on to the actual stuff that I'm talking about. I think, like I said, there's some people who are really, they lean into either the machine or the file, and that may not be the case. So if we look at it, I think it really helps quite a lot to understand that stuff. And I think it can help quite a bit to look over the things a little scientifically. And admittedly, Cindy, I'm kind of with this quick answer too. Unless you know or have experienced the same thing, or you're dead certain you have a pretty good concept of these things being correct, the chances are it's better just not to make a comment, or at least not to steer somebody very directly. Because I think when people are brand new, it can be it's almost too much for them to hear this cacophony of stuff without an explanation. Because the other thing I get a lot of too, here's the other thing, even if somebody does know what's going on, rather than either direct them to some proper material. So, hey, you got an article, maybe an article by yours truly that explains something, direct them to that link and say, this might help you. That's cool. Not as helpful. Pull comp sucks. Nothing else. When someone's brand new, they might not know what pull compensation is. They might not even know about pull and push distortion. I've found several people that I've been helping recently where they'll talk about an issue with gapping. They'll talk about an issue with lettering being the wrong heights, the kind of things that we know from pull and push compensation. And the person just goes, comp. And you're like, well, they don't even know what the thing is. And then, frankly, even if someone says increase your pull compensation, which might help the problem, if you don't stop for a second and either direct them to somewhere where they can learn more about it, or say, hey, all stitches under tension tend to get shorter. Satin stitches are going to get narrower all the time. Then they understand that what pull distortion is, and then they know why for the next time. This is definitely like you don't want to give the man a fish. You want to teach the man to fish. This is a good chance to teach some people to fish as far as digitizing is concerned. But let me kind of give you some actual stuff here. Let me let me kind of say, there's stuff going on for everybody, but let's actually get to the problems that I'm talking about and some of the stuff that I'm discussing. Because really, there are problems going on with this stuff, and certainly there are realities that people are sometimes right. The problem is feeding through all that stuff. It can be difficult. I do think there are a couple new types of work that people are doing that really we should explain. It's a category of things that go wrong, right? So we're talking about brand new digitizers. I mean, people who have just started, and don't get me wrong, in the commercial world, calling it brand new is a pun kind of intended, but they're working on stuff, even simple logo stuff, and they're having trouble. And a lot of it has to just do with the metaphor of embroidery and some stuff that we have talked about many times in a more artistic bed. As one of the things that I always say, and we're going to talk about this later, just because there's a continuous area of color, one area that is filled with one color in a piece of our art, it does not mean it will be a single embroidered shape. And the kind of corollary to that is people assume that if they're looking at a piece where the art does have a continuous area of color and someone else who made embroidery that they're comparing it to has some work done to break that area apart, that it's an automated thing that the software does in order to, rectify problems with a shape. And often that's not the case. And here's the one kind of new version that I want to talk about. We are used to this question about, with brand new digitizers, we're like, hey, can I convert a JPEG to a DST file? Can I convert a PNG to a DST file? We're used to this question about automation, where they're like, hey, I want auto digitizing. And very frequently, you will see when people are in the world for a little while and do know the difference between very nicely done digitizing artistic interpretation and carving up of shapes like we talk about on this channel. And you can go back through the back catalog and learn all sorts of things about silhouettes and digitizing for dimension, things like that. And we'll talk more about that to a degree. But we're used to coming back to somebody who's got, like, let's say, a poor file that's running poorly, that's not very well parsed, and saying, man, auto digitizer did that. That's the problem. And auto digitizer did that, and that's why it's crap and it doesn't work. And the truth of the matter is, though, automation certainly is part of this. And, I'm not a big fan of auto digitizing in most versions of it, almost anything that you can do with it, especially when we're talking about how do we parse a shape into embroidery objects that make sense. I'm not much for that kind of automation. The automation I like is stuff that adds a tool that I couldn't do in any other fashion, adds to my creative and technical options, not takes away from my decisions as someone who's interpreting the art. However, what we're seeing a lot more of, and it's something I've been talking about more and more often as I go to teach, are actually vector import problems. It's because they come from a world now where instead of redrawing, instead of dealing with raster images, raster being anything made of dots, so bitmaps, JPEGs, PNGs, GIFs, whatever you say it as. I learned GIF when I grew up. I know the creator says GIF, but that's a hard one to swallow for me, folks. Suffice it to say, any of those raster images, we were very much conditioned to bring those into our software, put them as a background behind our digitizing software's design area, and draw new shapes over them. Because that was the original way a lot of digitizing was done, or at least digitizing, yes, punching is even further off, where we're doing what we call cartooning, and there's a whole process of drawing out a 6:1, giant version of the piece where all of our satin stitches are marked, all our fill stitches are marked, our densities are marked with the Swiss wheel, what have you. that's the first version. Then we get into digitizing as we know it today. And even as we know it today, the first version of that digitizing really was about bringing in raster graphics, hey, scanning paper graphics very frequently, and then drawing new shapes on top. Because we're already drawing new shapes, and we were usually using tools that were made for a stitch type. Ladder entry on a satin stitch is a big one. Tools that were made to kind of feed back to you and say, a stitch type is built like this. Here's, if we start here and we do these ladder entry points on both sides of a column, you know that we're talking about a narrow object. Number one, we're talking about this narrow object, and that wherever those 2 points line up, we're going to have an angle of inclination for the stitches along that narrow column. And we understand very intuitively what that means. That kind of entry tool, that kind of scanning and redrawing meant that most of the stuff we made had the concept of embroidery in mind when we drew it. We knew that when we were making it, that was the case. And even in our automation, that, the initial auto digitizing as it was parsing that image was made in that way. Auto digitizing still takes shapes into account, in that if we have a nice long narrow column, auto digitizing is going to say, all right, well, I've got this very columnar thing or a border around something and it's narrow. The best option for something of about this width, under 10 millimeters, is to make that a satin stitch. And we're going to try and keep those stitches as close as we can perpendicular to the two edges of that column. And even auto digitizing will do that, understanding what a stitch is. When it comes to a complex border, it will break. It'll have problems trying to decide where to divide that border because it's not imagining the shapes that are underneath the needs of that piece of that complex border. And I'll show you what I'm talking about in a minute. And that's something that we said, all right, yeah, hey, you got a funky looking design. It's probably auto digitizing. It's all these people who sell auto digitizing on Etsy or wherever. And it's because they bring in art and they slap it through auto and out it goes. But we now have people who are bringing in vector. We have vector importers. And I'm going to actually say this is the next kind of digitizing I see causing problems for people. And yes, it still has some of the feelings of this automation problem, of this conversion problem. And I'm going to call them floodfill digitizers. What do I mean by this? All right, so if we're looking at a lot of these art pieces, the pieces that I see people struggling with over and over and over that don't work for them, especially as they get more complicated, it's because they're using, number one, artwork that is very coloring book-like, nice thick lines, big areas of solid color. And because they have that, they're using vector artwork that shows that. They end up with these big shapes, these big continuous pieces of color, like I talked about, that are very complicated if they're not broken up into multiple pieces. So let's actually bring in a sample that I made. Rather than call somebody out, I went ahead and made a sample of what I'm talking about to kind of give you a taste for where these problems come from. And so I can give you kind of examples of this flood fill digitizing. What I mean, and let me just say what I'm talking about flood fill. A flood fill is where especially it used to be always in paint software. Now you can do it readily in vector software, where you bring in your fill bucket tool, your paint bucket tool, and wherever you click that paint bucket cursor, the area that's enclosed in that line is now filled with color. People are used to working in vector. They're used to working in design software. And so the concept of coloring, filling an area with a color, and that being all we need to do is really common. And when we're working from like vector, invariably the vector that we get that is for print may not work for embroidery. It doesn't have compensation built into it. It may or may not take into account or at least have built into it things that are at the size that stitch types can run physically at the size of the overall logo. And most certainly it doesn't take into account things like stitch angles. So when we have a piece of art like that, it already has lines. And because our current digitizing tools allow us to import vector files, especially in the advent of SVG, a universal vector that works for most softwares, depending on how it's set up. You can also convert into other vector setups, but people are really used to working with vector, especially in the craft world. You're coming out of the craft world. SVG is very common. You can get stock SVGs everywhere. When I first came in getting vector art, the first vector art I ever had came off of CDs with a big catalog book attached. I am embarrassed to say that. They were old by the time I had them, but the first stock art I ever had to be pulled off of a CD full of those stock vector pieces, all in probably EPS format or worse, WMF or EMF formats for Windows, the meta formats. Suffice it to say, That stuff was built for print, and this stuff is often built for print or for cutting, meaning that overlaps may or may not be there. Definitely not the way that we need them for embroidery, but they have the shape. And because we can bring the shape as is into our software, into embroidery software, the concept is they think about it like a flood fill. They're like, well, I have shapes. I need to fill them with stitches. If I click my shape and then click a stitch type, now I have shapes full of stitches. Off to the embroidery machine we go without any knowledge of the medium or the technical nature of the stitches that are going on. So the first thing I'm going to say though, yes, I'm saying flood fill digitizers here. This is not me trying to arm you with a new insult for people who are doing bad work out there. If you're selling flood fill digitizing and it's not working for your customers and you're still taking money from them on Etsy, I don't have any choice, any words for you aside for some choice words. They're not very nice words. Do test your designs to make sure they work and don't put out bad work. However, for a new digitizer who's making stuff for themselves, and especially if they haven't been inundated and certainly taken into our inner circles of all this kind of esoteric stuff we learn how to do, this is not a pejorative. This is just something they learn to do and it causes them some pain. So let's bring in the sample, right? Let's talk about what I'm saying here. So flood fill digitizers, um, it's just this concept of converting vector in a way by just filling the shapes with stitches and thinking that that's enough to get it to work. When we're treating the embroidery machine as a thread printer. That's the other one I always say. Like, it's more than a thread printer. What I mean by that, if we treat it like a thread printer, we end up with these kind of problems. So here's this chili pepper, right? Here's chili. And I'll just bring this in. It is from a stock piece of vector you can go grab out there. And this is done in what I call that flood fill style. And it's one of the better versions of it because they have at least not done it the old school print style. Old school print style, you grab a piece like this. Usually this is one big flat piece of black behind the rest of the colors. If this is made for normal printing, printers are not going to take these overlapped areas and print more ink on top of an existing black slab. A regular printer, a paper printer, is generally going to ignore the overlapped areas, right? So this is slightly better than that. This is a piece of craft vector. This is vector made for cutting. So this is something that maybe would be used with a vinyl cutter, a Cricut machine, whichever one you like with craft cutting. But the thing is, you could import it like this. And so the person will bring this piece in, say, okay, I've got my chilies. I know that I've got the top of the chili that's in here, and I've got this part of the chili here. And if I follow all the colors, well, I want to fill that with black, and I want to fill that with green, and this with red. But what we can see is, if we're looking at this piece, immediately, even just in the way that this is put together, you can see that this is an absolute flattened image. Being that these are exactly on the same line. These are cut to the same line. There is no overlapping, number one. So we don't have anything that's compensated whatsoever. When we run these, we know what? All of these stitches are horizontal. Number one, this whole design is going to want to pull to the middle because a stitch is going to shorten along its length and pucker. It's going to try and do that. And with the whole design pulling to the middle, not only we have that problem, along these edges, as these stitches get narrower, we're going to see gaps definitely all along the horizontals. So anywhere we have these two pieces that are lined up and all those stitch angles are at the same angle, we're going to see gaps in between these colors because they are just absolutely perfectly kissing like a kiss cut would be for vinyl, right? So that you could lay these pieces together exactly. Now, even in vinyl, we do layering, but still, you'll find lots of art like this or art that is auto-converted, auto-scanned, not to embroidery files, but it is auto-vectored. And the auto-vectored art can be built like this too, where we have these shapes. But you'll see a few different things that are going to cause you problems already. Number one, you can see we've got a fairly complicated little fill here. And that fairly complicated fill now has some really weird angles, has some really weird textures along those edges. And immediately, I know that you folks who are digitizers, dyed in the wool, you're looking at this piece going, man, I really want to cut that stem off, and that should be a satin. And there should be at least 3 pieces of satin border in this piece instead of this big solid fill. The thing is, the person who did this is they're not malicious. They're not trying to impugn what we do as digitizers. They don't know. They brought in a vector. They said, I need this to be red fill. I found the fill button. I clicked it. And now it's fill. The other thing that they don't know, they don't see the start and end points that we have over here. And our little start and end points means that we're going to end in the middle of that fill and probably cause some weird puckering or something. They don't know that probably they'd be better served. Even if it's not perfect, you'd still want to have your start point on one side, opposite to your, perpendicular stitch angle. and then your endpoint somewhere else on the opposite side. It'd be a better, smoother run if you did. Uh, and they don't think about the traveling either between the two pieces. Plus, the layering may not make sense. We're running the borders first, so we'd have nice big gaps because that was what was first in the file. And then we're running all these little colored islands inside of these other pieces last. Why? Because when the original piece was built, it was built back to front in a print method where you would have that slab style building, but it was flattened out for use for cutting. So here's our cut file. Is this terrible? Yeah, unfortunately for embroidery, this will be pretty terrible. The results you're going to get out of this is gappy and awful and not going to look good whatsoever. So does this mean this person is awful? No, it means this person doesn't know what they're doing as far as the medium. It means that they need some better instructions from folks like us, and that really we have to recognize that where this problem comes from, like I said, it is a vector import problem, not an auto digitizing problem all the time. And what we'll often have people say is, that's auto digitizing. That's crap. Auto won't work, when the person says, but I digitized it. And to their minds and to their hearts, they did. They took a piece where it wasn't embroidery and now there's stitches there. Why, when it looks like this on screen? And here's the other thing we're going to talk about. Why, when it looks like this on screen, does it not look like this on my machine? And so these are some of the older problems, right? It's the same problems we've had forever. When we're talking about this stuff, invariably, we go back to the same stuff we've always discussed. Number one, they think it's going to be a WYSIWYG. What is it? What does WYSIWYG mean? It means what you see is what you get. Generally, aside from color management issues, what you see on screen when you're going to print to paper is what you get when you print. And honestly, on cutters, as long as you have your sizes set correctly, the shapes that you see are exactly, aside from, like I said, problems with the vector, quality problems with the vector being broken or something else, the shapes that are there in your software for cutters, any vector software, that's the path that cutting blade is going to take. And if they are right on top of each other, that's where they're going to land when they run, unless there's a pretty big problem with your cutter. Coming from that experience, instead of the one that we understand where we know embroidery as a medium from the beginning, you can see how that's a problem. Because honestly, for embroidery, what you see is never what you get. 100%. The measurements that are on screen when you go and run them will not be the measurements that come out. Won't. That's not an if. That's will not. That's not if there's a problem with your stabilizer. That's what you see on screen will never be exactly to the millimeter to the micron what you get on your machine. We're punching needles through fabric, layers of fabric, thousands of times. Any average design is 8,000 or more times. We are leaving behind little pieces of thread that stick through the fabric and stay there forever. We are taking a loop of thread and tying it around threads that are inside of that fabric and pulling them tight. And when they pull tight, our satin stitches all get narrower. And when we stack a bunch of thread together, it's a round physical object. It rolls off of each other. So the more density we build up, then as it rolls off of itself and it tries to pull down and under tension, all of our satin stitches get taller. We know that pull compensation and push compensation are necessary to make things work. If you didn't know that and you're looking on screen, the frustration can be very real. We know that from normal digitizing. Now imagine somebody has told you, hey, that's awful. It's auto digitized crap. And you're like, but I brought in the art and I digitized it. I worked on it. Flood fill, I put stitches on it and the stitches are there and it looks the way I want it to look on screen. What's going on? The truth is, a lot of folks haven't yet grasped this concept that what you see is never what you get, or the mean way that I often put it is the screen is a liar. It's lying to you. It hates you. It would like you to fail, and it wants you to waste that garment you're working on. The screen hates you. Does it hate you? No. But the problem really comes out of the problem that you still see with digitizers who do know a little bit, which is that, like I said earlier, a continuous color area does not mean it's going to be a single shape. We talked about building borders. I'm going to bring those examples back up and run through them a couple times just to show what I'm talking about. It often happens with things like the borders that I'm showing you here on this chili pepper. Frequently, people see a continuous area of color and they think, okay, I got to fill this with stitches. And they make it a single shape, and they think that multiple borders and things that just happen to be part of one continuous area of color were done by an automated process on the machine instead of drawing individualized pieces or individual embroidery objects to make things work. And you guys seen me pull apart a silhouette to make it more artistic, things like that. But it really does still come out of that same assumption. So here's what we're really dealing with: assumptions. It's not bad things. The assumption is first, they've dealt with a world of file types and things that can be converted. If you have an EPS or an AI file or any or sort of other file, you have an SVG file and it has to be a different file format, you can. It's a process of conversion. You move one to the other. Are there other things that go on inside of that? And can you have problems with vectors not working, converting from one format to the other? Yes. By and large, though, it is possible for you to take one and convert it to the other. Moreover, if you are working in a vector software and you know you need raster out of it, you need a transparent PNG out of the SVG you just made, you know that you can save that as this other thing, and it does make a raster file at size with all the settings you use out of the vector. So it's an assumption that conversion is how we get from one file type to another. It's an assumption that an embroidery machine has more intelligence in it and is a thread printer. They are not that intelligent. And I know it sounds terrible. There's lovely things going on in embroidery machines, not disparaging all the wonderful people who make them, but they are not as intelligent as to do interpretation of art on the fly yet. They haven't replaced us all with AI just yet. Give them time and they'll try, but it hasn't happened just yet. They are definitely not that way. They are much more fuzzy than that. And then we have assumptions from our side that if something turns out poorly, it's because they ran it through auto digitizing or they bought it from an auto digitizer, and that's why it looks junk. That's why it's not running well. And we have assumptions about whether something comes from a machine problem or whether it comes from a problem in the software. Do we have a digitizing problem? Do we have a functional problem with the way things are run or the materials? And the only way to really isolate that is to look at the problem pretty comprehensively or to look at the actual examples better. I mean, I hate to say this, there's so many times somebody will show an example of something going wrong, which to my eye, after many years of looking at samples, is very obvious. And it doesn't mean that I know stuff people don't know, but to me, I'm looking at this thing and I know what I had to do as a digitizer when I was in-house. I have to know pretty quickly when something's wrong on the machine, what remedies there are available. And frankly, there's often more than one way to go about it. Small shifts in registration, stabilizer might be an issue. Digitizing might fix it. Even if I don't choose to change one or the other, I might be able to massage my way into place with either one of those things, because the problem I'm having is shifting. If I can either stop the shifting in the hoop, so it could be hoop tension, stabilizer that's not holding up, or it could be compensation issues. I could change the compensation, change the alignment of one layer to another, and those things could all temporarily or permanently fix that problem for me. Because all I have to do is make sure that I'm not seeing the shifting that is causing me trouble or the distortions causing me trouble. Problem is, some of them are better kind of modes of operation or work better for different people for different reasons. If you are trying to have a very light garment, throwing more stabilizer under a very light garment to deal with some registration problems is probably not the best call, because it's going to make the garment harder to wear and feel bad and look worse. But is there a time when stabilizer is the right answer? Yeah, sometimes it is, especially if you're using very light stabilizers. You've backed it way down below the normal level and you're using a heavier design that is usually something you would reasonably put on that stabilizer and fabric combination. You might have to make some slight concessions to the world of stability and say, I need a little bit tougher stabilizer that's going to arrest some of the movement or dimensional distortion, the squishing and stretching and shifting of the process. And you might do things like adhere your piece down. You might have a fusible stabilizer, or you might use a light embroidery adhesive to hold something down. At the same time, where a light embroidery adhesive will work, if that's going to work, the other thing that would work is if under the design you have room, like our chili that was fully filled, to do some underlay that stitches down the file, almost like an internal basting stitch. You stitch down the material underneath the design before you run it. That will hold that fabric down. Because what did we do? The problem we were having was fabric is shifting and not attaching to our stabilizer. We could handle that by fusing it with an iron and fusible stabilizer, sticking it down with embroidery adhesive, or putting it in the hoop, making sure it's as flat as it can be, and running nice long stitches that are not likely to cause too much distortion with pull and push, and doing some straight stitching around either the inside in a star pattern or somewhere in a shaped pattern around underneath the design to stitch the fabric down. Those three answers will all solve the same problem. So sometimes we come out there out of the gate, and maybe even myself included, if I'm not watching myself, and we give people some pretty pat answers to problems that we might not, we might need to talk about the why. Why are we having a problem? Because the top layer of very shifty, very flexible material is moving around on top of the stabilizer. What can we do about it? Anything that adheres it down so it stays nice and flat and smooth. There are better and worse answers for everybody. In massive amounts of production, if you can get it done on the machine without any adhesives, that's going to be better for production overall. But if you're making one, you want it perfect, and you absolutely want to lay that stuff flat, gluing it down or fusing it will make sure that that is absolutely going to stay flat and smooth, and it's a wonderful way to get a beautiful sample out of that piece. It all depends on the way you're trying to get this done. But when we're talking about digitizing itself, frankly, the problem that I'm seeing the most right now has to do with this kind of flood fill digitizer mentality. Nothing's wrong with it. You can use flood fills in certain areas. Heck, I will tell people over a certain size, sometimes people will convert regular keyboard fonts into, stepped turning fills. And there's over a certain size where I really prefer a shape where I take the outline of the letter entirely and I fill it entirely and put a nice satin stitch border around it. The largest letters that I do will usually be like that. And those are fantastic from Vector. You can literally grab true type font, don't do any conversion, don't split it up, throw your big varsity letter up there, fill it from top to bottom and put a nice satin stitch border, and you can use the same Vector object and just copy and paste it to do that. That's a fine way to make a letter. Add your compensation, make sure your angles are doing great. Don't go straight horizontal on your H so that the tops and bottoms split when the satin stitch comes down and splits apart your stuff. You want to have a nice 15-degree angle on that or something around there. So yes, there's stuff we do to change it, but there's nothing wrong with using the flood fill method for stuff that it makes sense on. It's when we do the flood fill method with anything more complex. And like I said, the other big problem that we have is when we're doing something like this. This shape is now pretty complex, and that's not nearly the kind of stuff I've seen. I've seen somebody take, in fact, the one that I just saw was a character, a copyrighted character from the Star Wars universe who might or might not be a big-eared youngin'. And somebody took a pretty detailed SVG, and all of the outlines were done as one slab of tatami fill. That tatami fill now is, if it's too narrow, you don't want to fill inside that column because it's going to try and drop that needle a couple times, depending on the minimum stitch points. You're going to have this less than a millimeter outline that's somewhere inside the face of said critter. And we are going to drop that needle 2 or 3 times trying to cross that less than a millimeter, depending on how the software they were using was processing that shape or those stitches. We need to use stitches for the right occasions. We need to use them for the right shapes. And we need to pay attention to how these things are put together. Plus, this thing is going to have a ton more travel. If we think about what has to happen, even if I fill it from bottom to top, I'm going to have to keep tracking back into and around all of these holes. It makes a lot more sense, not only because we're dealing with a satin stitch, but because of the traveling, not to have these fills that have myriad little holes. Because even if we're filling just one shape top to bottom, and we're happy with that fill stitch, and all of the areas are large enough to accommodate a tatami fill stitch, you have to imagine as we're trying to fill line by line, and I'll kind of draw this with my hands to kind of make this clear because I know I talk with my hands a lot, but this makes sense. If we're trying to go line by line and draw it down, every time I have a gap, if I'm trying to go around this hole, I'm going to go drawing down here, and then I have to track under and go around it and go back to the side, and then I have to track on the other side of the hole. And if we think about having multiple little holes all over, now I'm tracking back and forth over and over in the attempt for the fill stitching to start at the top and end at the bottom. It's tracking in and out around those holes over and over and over again. So even if it was an okay stitch to use for the type of object we're looking at, using this flood fill mentality on a piece that has a lot of holes in it, especially the outline on a piece like this, is it's just a chance for things to go wrong in your software, and certainly it's not going to give you the best quality look. But you can see, especially if you're sitting here like me, you're sticking yourself in the place of this absolute beginner. Does this look outwardly horrible as stitches when you're just looking at it on screen? I don't like the rendition, but if you wanted a super cartoony version of a chili and it's all fill stitches, aside from the border is killing me right now, is regular flat fill without curves, without any other work, bad? No. And you can see why somebody who doesn't know any difference, or maybe has not spent time really developing this eye for embroidery that we talk about a lot, would look at that and say, oh, well, it looks all right. It looks like what I'm seeing in the store. And honestly, when you say that, you're like, all right, yes, that maybe that's okay for them. Maybe they feel okay about it. But even just very minor changes for us, where this is the stuff that drives us nuts. We're saying, okay, let's say if I can still use this, I could separate this out. I could break it across. I could make different shapes. And I might decide, hey, the cap of the chili looks like it's on top of the other. So I'm going to do the border that's around the chili first so that the border on the cap will go over it and it adds another layer to it. This is stuff we think about. And honestly, part of the other problem I'm going to say is that people haven't looked at enough embroidery when they're first starting. And you have to stop and tell them, hey, yes, this looks okay on screen. Yes, it stitches. Yes, the colors are where you want them. Have you ever seen a piece of embroidery somewhere in any other realm where everything is done in big flat fills like this? And if you go look online and you tell them, hey, why don't you just go look at some other embroidery? Just look at embroidery to get an idea about it. The chances are they have not seen something like that. And that's the thing. A lot of it is really just about not spending that time. And the great thing is this. I'm going to just show you very quickly. Yes, this isn't all that we need to do. We have a lot of other stuff we need to do. But even if you wanted to start from these shapes, it's not that it would necessarily take you a tremendous amount of time to try and get this into a different position. And you can use these shapes as a starting point as long as you're willing to do some work to get your compensation right. You can go ahead and break this out and say, all right, I got this. I got this top shape, and I actually did this in the wrong order because I'm sitting here fighting with my system a little bit. As you guys know, when I'm streaming, sometimes it makes things slow down. But you can say, all right, now I'm going to build that border. Now I'm going to have, there's the one satin stitch. The other one should probably go under it, but I can change that sequence later. Let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to have to fix that cut and that overlap. But if you take a little time to understand the stuff, even what we've got here, now I've got some nice satin stitches. And if we go over to here, yeah, this angle's not good. We don't like this, but we can massage this. Hey, let's grab this. Even it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be exactly everything we want it to be in order for it to function and be a decent piece. Go ahead and give it this. Now I've got a nice overlapped. I've got this lovely little overlapped mitered corner here. We have a nice little satin stitch going around that. If we jump over here, we know we want that stem separated. We can go ahead and break that across. We can grab this piece, add some lines, and now you can see I'm doing a little bit of what a flood fill digitizer does. And certainly this is not my proudest hour making this piece. I might have to change some stuff, but I'm starting to get some assets that make sense. You see what I'm saying here? I'm starting to get some pieces that make sense, and it really doesn't take that long for some of us to kind of lean in and say to our flood fill and friends here, like, all right, we need to do a little bit different work here. Let's say we want to have these in some different pieces. We want to put some mitering together. Depending on the software, you might have to do it slightly differently, but we can say, let's break this apart. Let's go ahead and work on these pieces and make something a little different out of them to make it make sense. It's not that much more. And if we start to kind of help them with that why, we can get them to this point very quickly. And I think that's the thing. I don't think they have to be lost in flood fill land forever. And they also have to understand that just because the lines don't line up perfectly to what they were originally looking at on screen, that is not somehow a failure or a problem. And once they know that and they understand kind of the entirety of what that means, and you show them some of these examples, maybe show them some of your own work if you've been digitizing a bit, we can kind of help to marshal these people in a better way. And so instead of being like, hey, it's crap because it's auto, it's crap because you filled in some stuff, let's stop. Let's talk to them. And like I said, I'm doing this wildly and I'll have to fix a bunch of stuff down the road if I was trying to make this for real. But at the same time, you can see how quickly I can come up with something where now I've got something here. I need to work out these miters, whatever. I need to work out my sequencing, but I now have some shapes that make sense. I've got some nice mitered corners. I can decide how I want to do the intake and the output on these. I can decide how I want to handle the overlap. But now I've got some stuff that makes sense. If I wanted to go in here, you can use some automation. I could grab this piece and use a little bit of expansion. We use inflation. We could leave the corners. They're not ideal, but I could jump out here and say, all right, I want a good couple millimeters of overlap. Say okay to that. And now I have some compensation. Is that quite enough? Probably not. This piece is pretty big, so maybe it'd be all right. At the size I actually would intend it. This is the other thing. They brought it in at a size, and they probably need that fixed. But think about how little this takes if we explain some of this stuff. A lot of it really isn't so onerous, so awful, so hard for us to kind of help these folks out with. And really, a lot of what they need to learn is about looking at other embroidery. If they looked at a couple pieces of embroidery, this stuff would start to make sense. Do I need to alter these shapes more? Absolutely, I do. I'm just playing. But you can see how quickly that our little flood fill person, given a little bit of kind of kindness and explanation, could learn, hey, maybe you want about a halfway overlap, depending on the size of this piece, up into that satin. Go ahead and make some overlaps, expand some pieces. Don't have the place with no overlapping, and then we have to change some sequencing. But it's not outside of the realm of possibility if they have that explanation. So, like I said, is this for me? I'm not trying to chastise us for feeling like, hey, you're not taking care of digitizing the way we would like you to. I get it. We feel that. And honestly, we can also talk to them about more artistic version stuff. We can throw some textures and some curved fills at them. We can help them out with something that looks a little nicer. We can work with these folks and make something better happen for them for sure. But the same thing to remember is like, as we're working with people, just to understand that they are coming from a place where they don't know this stuff and that it's okay for them not to know it, but that we can kind of give them those hints like, hey, just look at some more embroidery. Is this what embroidery looks like in other places? Is this what we really want it to look like? Look at all the examples. We are lucky enough to be in a world where online are tremendous numbers of examples from the greatest minds who have ever done just about anything we want to learn to help us learn this stuff, up to and including what I always call retail research, which is just kind of talking about what's out there as far as commercial embroidery stuff that's on the shelves right now. The stuff that's on the shelves is often what they're trying to emulate anyway. But as we can see, a little bit of work. I'd have to mess with my technical stuff. This size is also wild. This is a pretty big piece that came out of that original vector because the vector was made pretty large. That's, we're looking at over 5 inches. Let's say we want this to fit in there. That's the other thing they probably don't necessarily know. They want to put that in their 4-inch hoop or whatever. Looks like I had a couple pieces didn't get selected there, but easily enough, we get down to this point and we look at our piece now, and I've got a nice little chili, right? This still needs work on the technicality of it. Still needs the underlay fix, needs some sequencing done for it, for sure. At the same time, we're on the bead. We're there where it needs to be to start making something that looks good and that runs good, and it doesn't have to be so crazy. And we can kind of explain this and make it a better time for folks who want to learn. In any case, so that's the thing I want to talk about for new digitizers. Hopefully, I'm going to go into some comments and see if you guys have some other stuff to discuss. I probably won't go much longer today as things have been very hectic already, and I've got a lot to do that's dealing with the other issues that I'm not just going to share. Like I said, personal lives can be personal lives, and that's cool. Everything's okay, going to be fine, but very hectic. The thing is, I wanted us to take this concept and think about what brand new digitizers are facing now. Because a lot of us have come to this from a previous era, and maybe it's not quite that different from what they're doing now. But the technologies have advanced a little bit. The availability of free open source drawing software for vector and the flood of assets of available SVGs make a difference for people. And they may be coming to this with very different assumptions about what they want. But like I said, we can talk about this stuff more. I'm going to show some more examples of the stuff so that if you are a new digitizer who's currently a flood fill digitizer and you're here right now, you will have some concepts of what I'm talking about. I can show you some stuff to make you kind of clear on this idea, especially the biggest concept I can get across to you, aside from knowing about distortion. I mean, of course, what you see is never what you get. Any stitch that you stitch on your machine, even if it's this wide on screen and it looks like this is wide on screen forever, will always be a little shorter. Any stack of stitches that you get at full density, so 0.4 millimeters or 4 embroidery points for a 40 weight thread, if you stack them at that density or higher, they're going to want to roll off of each other, and you're going to get any satin column will be a little bit taller than what you made it on screen. Get that through. But then the next thing that's going to help you with all of your interpretation of art, with all of the work that you're doing, whether it's logo work or something more intense, is that a continuous area of color does not mean it is a single shape in your software. Just because it is all this area is black, like the border that I just showed you, all this area is blue, whatever it is, doesn't mean that that's one shape, or that you can take that one shape and do some automated process on it in the software that is going to break it up by itself to make all the various borders and shapes and pieces that you need. Frequently, you're going to be breaking it up yourself, like I showed you, by altering the art that you brought in. That's one easy way to start from that flood fill perspective and move to the perspective of a digitizer. Even better, for my mind, is to draw stuff, to redraw it, bring in your art, flatten it out, and lock it, put it underneath everything, gray it down so you can see on top of it, and then draw your new embroidery shapes. And part of this is to look at embroidery, whatever kind of embroidery you like, whether it's sport stuff, whether it's patches, militaria, lace, go look at embroidery. What direction are the stitches running? If you have size and you can tell what the size of the overall object or design is, how wide are my satin stitches? How far in my satin stitches are my underlays? Let's say I have my little edge run underlays. How deeply tucked is the inset? How close together are the stitches themselves? What is my density? Look at embroidery and also look at designs that you know, like mascots. And how did we break up that mascot into the different pieces of embroidery? Where are the fills at? Which order do they run in? And can you tell if something's on top of something else? When we look at a border, is it broken up into multiple columns that go in different directions? One stitch angles this way, one stitch angles this way. Why is that? And which one goes first? Look at those things and observe. Careful observation will help, but this is something you have to understand. These two are really huge. What you see on screen is never what you get. Assume the distortion, and continuous color areas in art doesn't mean they're a single shape. Can they be? Absolutely, they can be. Many times, especially with complex shapes like borders or compound shapes, something else I've done an entire episode on, they will be made up of multiple shapes. And in fact, let's do that real quick. I do actually have some stuff we can talk about on that scale, and I just want to kind of bring that up. I'm going to show you a slide from one of the slideshows that I've taught previously. This is one of my classes, but something that I talked about. We did a compound shapes episode, but I still want to show this really quickly, just to kind of make this point a little clearer one more time. Often we're going to look at a shape and we can see that there are compounds. Yes, this doesn't look like that border on the chili, but it's similar. If we were rendering this in a single color, we look at this. If you render it in flood fill, just because the vector is this edge, we can already tell that this doesn't look very good. Plus, if we look at this shape, the software, as it tries desperately to fill, let's say we start at the bottom and end at the top of one of these hooks, is going to be filling up into a junction, trying to fill in, then traveling back, and then filling in and traveling back, filling in, traveling back, all up and down. Going to be a ton of wasted stitches and a ton of extra density. But if we look at how you might actually digitize it, something you would expect, you'll see that each of these leaflets in the foliage is an individual satin stitch. And it also means that when I made this piece, I drew each one of these individual leaves and overlapped them so that they would become to be this entire compound piece. And though that seems really complicated, it's all about isolating the shapes. And in this case, I wanted satin stitches, so I know that I have to stay under a certain width, and I want to overlap them so that we have this kind of building of the leaves. And it's about looking at other embroidery. This looks very much like classic, old school, like Swiss lace work. It looks like classic old school embroidery that you might see on any sort of foliated acanthus style work. Looking at even hand embroidery would show you things very similar to this. Whereas it's very easy when you have a vector, as we saw previously, and here I am moving around stuff that I shouldn't be. I just jumped out of my example. Let's see if I can go back to that again. Because I had that on search. I didn't have it on the normal stuff. So we look at compound shapes. Again, very, very much similar as I showed you in that lettering example here. We look at that. That flood fill is very easy for us to do if we have the vector. If we have the vector of this edge, we can say, make it a fill and go. And some software, we can even say, make it a satin, and it will try desperately. But if you have a complicated shape like this, or any place where we have three columns coming together, it's going to have to decide where to break those. And it's going to cause some very weird looks that aren't this artistic version we have here. And certainly, yes, we can see that in acanthus work, stuff like that, but it's the same thing that's happening in borders and outlines. It's the same thing that's happening even in other decorative areas, but borders and outlines and things like that very commonly are similar. And we see that in our chili here, as I finally built it, we have layering where this piece, the chili itself, is underneath this cap. We have that nice shadow because that's on top of the other piece. Also that the stem is underneath and further back from the cap. And that's done through sequencing and through planning ahead for those cuts. It's something that you can see in your mind that the software can't. Even if this software, if you did an automated software and decide to split it might split it flat across and not give you the little point on the cap. It might not do any sort of mitering in this corner, or it might not order them in the way you want to, where it lets the chili area, let's say that this satin stitch in the top of the chili would connect to the bottom of the cap and be on top of this back of the cap so that it looks a little weird, like this outline that really should be further closer to us than the chili itself, because we know that is the little leafy crown on top of the chili, uh, the blossom end of the chili. Should be closer to us. It should be on top of this piece, and it makes it look a little weird and not very dimensional. And that's because we would be relying on automation, even if we were doing that. But with flood filling, as you saw previously, it really doesn't work that way. If we look at things like mascots, and here's an example I've used before, you can see how we have these individual satin stitches making up the feathers in the background. Is this all one slab of orange? Yes, you could make it a big orange fill, but the texture is much more interesting if we don't. And we can see that we build this up. Also, that the white outline on this is not part of the white background. White background is a nice curved fill. Also, this beak is made out of 3 satins. We have a little satin for the back of the beak that's furthest away from us. We have one for the bottom of the beak that's closer to us. And then the top of the beak, which is the closest to us and which in a real bird would layer over top of the lower beak, is further toward us. It's on top of the layer underneath it. That's dimension. And then we build up each of these kind of feather shapes that are in the back of the eagle. The orange feather shapes is built up from multiple overlap satin stitches. That's not a function of the software. That is drawing individual satin stitches so that we do get the outline of the orange area we intended, but that we get some texture and we can change those angles of the satin stitches as we move up the piece. So we get this much more interesting, nuanced shape that is a little more put together, that doesn't look like a big slab. And we don't have the weird overlapped pieces, or do we have the perfect kiss cuts where we're going to have things pull apart and cause distortion and cause gapping. As we go through this piece, you'll see there's actually a fairly simple outline. As far as the white outline, this is using a very normal column with very little work done to it. In fact, this doesn't have any mitering in it. But as we go into the black in the piece, once again, notice that that area of the eye is all one big black slab in the vector, but it's made up of 4 different pieces of satin stitch. We have the center of the eye, the ring that's around the eye, the little line indicating the back of the eye, and then the eyebrow, which is done last, and it's on top of the others to give it that look. We're using that on purpose to get that dimension. This is actually on top of the beak. You probably could do it differently, but I decided to run all the black at once. And that was a production decision, right? And some of the decisions were made for production's sake. But our outline, once again, is made of multiple pieces to layer in a way that is more sensible. You also see how we have these overlapped feathers in the back so that it looks like each of these feathers builds up to the back of the neck at the top. So the feathers build up on top of each other, and eventually we end up with the full outline. The same thing is happening in a lot of these other outlines. You can see that when we're here in the outlines on the Monsanto Monarch, which is this lovely purple lion friend we have here, well, that this tail is behind the flank of the lion. And this is going to pull apart and it's going to show more of that purple. You can't see that on screen because it's going to happen when it's on the machine. The pull distortion will make these lines thinner because what you see is never what you get. So as we run through the piece, we can see, yes, I've got these other outlines. And in fact, you'll see that's even made up of multiple pieces because we have some fill-in areas back here that are done before the rest of the outline gets done. So we end up with those little fill-in areas and they're layered in such a way to make it look interesting, right? But when we get up into our actual piece, number one, here's the purple. The tail is made up of multiple satin stitches so that there are lovely textured splits in the tail that don't show any gaps. So we have those lovely, very much like the acanthus leaves, where we have these little areas. Those are overlap satins in this classic kind of mascot style. Also, you'll see even in that fill, I talked about the silhouettes. Even in that fill, we have 2 different curvatures on the fill where one leg is in front of the other. And you'll see that, and you especially see it if I zoom in on the lines, how the belly is rounded with a curved fill, how we have a little bit of overlap right there at the hip so that we don't have any gapping, and how we have a different angle in the arms than we do in the face or the body. So even in that purple body, if we go through this one more time, you'll see that that purple body is made up of multiple objects. One area of color does not necessarily mean one object. Could I have filled that with one big slab of fill? Yes, you could, but in doing so, you lose out on all the textures that are inherent in these pieces. But you draw them. You work from what's furthest away from you to what's closest to you as best you can. You often make, sacrifices. And sometimes when you're covering things with a border in between them, you don't have to worry quite so much what's on front, what's in the back, because if there's a border that's coming out later and covering that junction between those objects, you won't see it. But you can see what I'm talking about. In all of these pieces, they are built from multiple objects, and at no time have I gone in with a vector of our friend Monty here, the Monsanto Monarch, and have I just said, okay, the black, boom, stitch type. If you did that, it would be an absolute mess. And we'll go ahead and we can talk about all these different pieces, but you can see once again the borders on Karen Kuhn photography. There's some production reasons why I ran them in a different order, but at the same time, you see that the border is not one piece. Even on each one of these banners, the border is made of multiple pieces to make that work. We talk about this is the Kilmer baseball hats piece. Is the border that's underneath. It's a reveal border. The one thing to say about this is when we look inside of there, that there are individual satin elements, that these are separate pieces. This is not just border this whole thing. It has an outline around it. As we see, it breaks up. That is a column. Then there's a new column here, then another one, then another one, then another one. I had to split these little tabs that go in between the letters off and do them manually. Same thing in general in a lot of these pieces. And I'll actually go to something even simple. You can see that even in this piece, do I have one border on the whole thing and then interior pieces? No. Each one of these borders stacks into the next one so that it looks like from the blue to the white to the red that it's coming closer toward us, right? That these lines are stacking in space toward us the way the art looks. Not all of it is necessary to do it that way, but I think you do end up with a better look overall thinking about that stuff. So like I said, I just want us to take a thought about this as far as brand new digitizers. Yeah, those two things are probably the biggest things you're going to have to deal with. You're going to have to divorce yourself from believing in the screen. You're going to have to start thinking about objects as what can I do with embroidery to fill that area? It's not necessary for things to be one object. I can fill that space of color any way I want with any number of stitches, as long as I get the coverage that I'm happy with. And I get out to deal with things like the pull and push compensation, so I don't have gaps and problems like that are technical problems. And when we're talking to brand new digitizers, those of us who've been around a while realize that, yeah, automations are really an issue. The assumption that this is file conversion can be a problem for folks, but it's not done maliciously. And also that lots of people now are doing vector import. Why? Because it works for everything else. They come from the cutter world, they come from the print world, and they're used to it. And honestly, they think WYSIWYG, what I see on screen is what I get. And also they're used to just filling areas with color and having it turn out. And with the assumption that there's automation and smarts inside of the machines or inside of the software that are going to make all these choices for you and do them in an artistic, correct way, they think that, hey, if I fill it with stitches, it's going to know what to do. That's all I have to do to make my printer work. I don't have to do any other extra work for that. But we know that that's not quite the case with this. What you see is never what you get. Definitely, just because an area is all in one color and continuous, unbroken, doesn't mean it should be a single shape. Let's grab some comments before we get done here. Like I said, stuff that I wanted to get through. It's just that I keep seeing this very similar problem. Import SVG, fill everything, fill the black outlines. Everything's cut out flat like this. We have a lozenge of color inside of a hole in a fill, and the edges pull in and everyone's frustrated, and they've been working. Plus, for them, if they're not used to the way this process goes, they might be like, man, I spent 20 minutes, 30 minutes. I didn't just say convert from one to the other. I spent 30 minutes or an hour filling all these individual things with stitches, and now it doesn't work. For those of us who've spent 40 hours on a design, on a really big, complicated design, we're used to the time things take, and we're not having those expectations. Let's go ahead and grab some of this stuff too. All right, so Cindy King says, I haven't figured out on the home embroidery side, they can scan, cut, scan auto, digitize, and it works. Kind of. Then here, applique is kind of a special thing too, because honestly, if you can make the outline shape and you run applique underneath that, it's not going to be the same kind of distortion that fully filled embroidery is. You know that we don't get pull distortion in that same way with applique. So if you could scan a shape and it's nice and clean, you can put an edge outline around it. The problems they actually have in the applique world is that they'll have overlapping stuff and not know how to cut it out. And so they end up where they have multiple overlapped outlines because we've got something that has a big cut out of it. But if you just bring those outlines into your software and say, fill that with make that an applique object, generally you're going to see it go the entire way around. So let's say we have a circle and another circle and it's cut into each other. it'll do the entire circle, including the bite out of it, and then it'll do the other circle that's inside of that bite. And we've got a fully doubled border on it. They don't know that they have to eliminate a section out of there to leave room for the next piece that's coming on. It's usually with kids stuff, you see a lot of like birthday numbers, big birthday numbers with a design on them, and they end up where the number in the vector art that they got from whatever place has the entirety of the number, and then they have a logo or a something, a baseball, whatever, stuck on the front of it that's on top of it, but there's no way for to cut it out. And even if it's a vector and has a cutout of it, the border is still a unified border. It's not in the software. It's a closed shape and it wants to stitch all the way around the outside edge. That can be an issue. Otherwise, yes, to a degree, there is more ability with a plain applique shape to bring it in as is and make applique work. But at the same time, not knowing how embroidery works, not knowing densities, not knowing stitch types, not knowing sequencing, and definitely not understanding that the software can't always find that there's something on top of something else, especially when they run exactly with each other, or maybe they don't overlap in a way where even in Brilliance that does do some automation on that side can see it. There might be a gap because it doesn't take a large gap to make that get, out of sequence where they think it's that way, or it's not two designs. And so the assumption from digitizing software is, hey, you put stitches where you wanted them. I'm not taking them out of there. You need to go ahead and draw around. You need to break up that shape so you don't have those stitches there. And I mean, that's certainly another lesson. If you don't want stitches somewhere, don't put them there. But that's the thing, because they're used to scanning and cutting, working for other things, it can be kind of difficult, it can be kind of difficult. But yeah, and that's the thing. You're right, Ron. They're missing the art and the science behind digitizing. They are, but that's the thing. They don't know that it's even there. There's no there for them. This is an unknown. We've talked about this before, where if you don't know that it's there at all and people immediately just go, you used automation, it sucks. But then also there are some companies who are out there selling automation to people, telling them this is going to do it. Just click poof and it's gone. You can send it to the machine. But they don't talk about the quality issues that can come with it, or that when they do that, let's say they bring in a really complicated logo and they say, all right, you can use photo stitch or whatever different kind of, there's multiple different automations, either auto digitizing or a photo version of it. And it's going to look like what you got on your hat from the game. I got the mascot. Here's the art from their website, slap and go. It should look just like the hat that I bought when I was on site. That's a very different problem. And I think sometimes some tools have been a little overly free with the concept that it's going to be click and be and done. It's not that there's no automation that works in that field, but frequently it's certainly not going to give you what a digitizer would give you. And so that's missing. But yeah, it's a thing to do. And like I said, even if you're never going to digitize entirely for yourself, learning the elements of what works and how digitizing works, and certainly knowing push compensation, pull compensation, the way that we sequence things and layer them, even if it's just so you can talk to a digitizer to help them fix a problem for you, is really worthwhile. And Liz says something very similar. So this is why I learned some digitizing basics. Some online designs are a disaster. Ask me how I know. Absolutely. And experience on a machine is going to teach people more than anything. It's the absolute best teacher you can get, is to get a needle and thread and fabric together as often as possible. And yeah, it's kind of hard, right? So, and we have Jerry just saying, my outlines are usually in too far. That's what the test sew is for. Yeah, absolutely. Test sew is a big deal. Also understanding, if you're somebody here who's brand new, that if you sew on stabilizer or something else and then sew on something different for your final piece, 2 stacks of cutaway stabilizer does not act the same way under the needle, under tension, as a sweatshirt. If it looks great on stabilizer, likelihood on the sweatshirt it's going to be distorted and junky. You need to find yourself some sample material that's very simple to what you're doing if you want a one-to-one comparison. And also, the other thing is, people often think things look worse on stabilizer because stabilizer will make satin stitches look very feathered at the edge sometimes, where you'll do text and be like, man, this text looks really rough. Whereas on material, it doesn't have that same stark contrast, especially like black text on white stabilizer, and all these little fingers of stabilizer are in between the stitches. And they're also sometimes fraying and coming loose because stabilizer starts to fall apart, especially when people do it on tearaway. Like, man, these letters look really rough. And I'm like, stitch them on fabric. Funny enough, it'll look better than the stabilizer in that condition, specifically, especially white with a dark version on top of it. Or if you're, God forbid, you're running black stabilizer and white thread on top of it, either of those is going to look pretty rough. But definitely like black lettering on white stabilizer looks terrible. It makes it look really thin and kind of awful. So yeah, it's the thing, right? It's the thing. I will say this, yeah, technology is very different. Ron started in 87, 88, so it's way before me too, because I started back in the very late 90s. So you have to assume I was out there like 99, 98. That's when I first very first touched this stuff. And it was very different then already, the technology. But, and he's right about this, the basics of embroidery and the physicality of how thread works, the needle works, and stitch types in general. Yes, there's new stuff. Hey, over at Brilliance, we made new stuff because we really kind of pioneered the programmatic patch edge that we have in Stitch Artist 3 and in Merrily. That's something new as far as something wasn't around before. There's lots of different motif stuff. Brian did some really excellent sashiko work. So if you like sashiko stitches, there's some really cool stuff he did that is new. Now, certainly some stuff has come around later that's similar too, but yeah, that wasn't around as a programmatic stitch when I first came in. But yeah, it has changed a little bit, but the basics of, overlapping, sequencing, pull and push distortion, and honestly knowing that what you're looking at on screen does not stitch out the way you expect and that you have to compensate for that, that's been around for the entire time, obviously. So yeah, and Jurita says, I'm working on 5 years, but I've learned so much. Every year you do. I learn so much every time I get back to the machine or when I see people's stuff too. So that's just how that is. Cindy says, I don't think I've ever heard the term flood filling. Yeah, flood fill. And it's not really an embroidery term. It's more of it's a term for graphic art software. A flood fill just being the paint bucket. If you've ever looked at any graphic art software, whether it's paint software, hey, Paint in Windows has a flood fill. It just means that inside of a closed area, if you have an area that is fully enclosed, you click inside there with your fill paint bucket tool, it fills that entire area with whatever is selected, whatever color is selected usually, though it could be gradients or something else. I'm not going to get super technical, but yeah, the flood fill is just the idea that I've got an enclosed shape and I want to fill it with something. And so the concept for me, it just kind of clicked with me today, honestly, getting prepared for this and talking about this episode, that's the kind of digitizing I'm seeing. It's not people who are auto converting necessarily. They're bringing in their vectors and they already have outlines for where they want stitches to go. And they're just thinking, all right, in here, fill red, in here, fill green, in here, fill black. And they don't necessarily know what the stitches are doing, what stitch angles have to do with anything, what densities are, what underlay is at all, for sure. And so they're just looking at it. And when they see the 3D previews, which is often the default view for embroidery software, that default 3D preview is kind of giving them a false sense of security because it looks a lot like an embroidery. And it certainly looks like any kind of auto-generated, 3D preview or 3D effect of somebody would using graphic software to make embroidery look a certain way. That's the hard part. There's no gap and suddenly there is. We have to imagine it like this. For those of us who know, we know when we're looking at a piece that there could be a problem when two pallets of stitches are sitting right next to each other. We have these two squares that are stitched and the edges just meet. We can see in our minds already that the pull is going to start causing that gap in the middle. For them, they look on screen. I made a thing. The thing has a border. They look like they're touching. The green and the red are touching, and they should be. And then I get to the machine, and what the heck is the machine doing? It's screwed up. It didn't do it right because here I'm looking at it and it's right. I understand that it's easy for us who know that now to get kind of indignant and go, that's what embroidery does, dude. What are you talking about? Learn, get good, scrub. But that's not a great attitude for us. It's like the old hacker, RTFM, and I'm going to be the nicest way I can about it. As I read the friendly manual, even though I am somebody who I want to feel that way sometimes, I say, I do want you to read the friendly manual. We all spend a lot of time writing those things on the other side of this world. But at the same time, that attitude's not really great for encouraging somebody to embroider. The best thing is to accept that and realize that, hey, if we went to go, let's say you've never done 3D printing and you go to do 3D printing and you do something wrong with supports. If you know 3D printing, you know what I'm talking about. You're layering these three-dimensional layers of something with, we're squishing plastic out of an extruder at heat, and maybe we let it flop over too much and it all falls down and falls apart. Somebody else who knows this stuff will be like, yeah, you can't print out into open air, man. You got to put something underneath that to hold it up. You need supports. Why didn't you run your slicer a certain way? A lot of these words that I just said are obvious to 3D printing people and not to us. We just have to remember that that's what embroidery sounds like to somebody who's not initiated in it. All right. We also have a couple of other questions. I have one good question I'm going to finish on because this is a nice question. John R. says, sorry if this is already asked, do you have any tips for educating potential clients about quality issues caused by low quality digitizing? and why we should charge to use the pros that clients understand. The best thing you can do for that is samples. If you've got a piece you've already run that has poor quality digitizing, grab that sample, stitch it out, have that ready to show them next to a sample of a good piece done with the same art. You can fake it if you have to. I know it sounds really rough too. If you've seen what people do that doesn't look good, hey, like this flood fill digitizing, take that little chili art like I just did, do the flood fill method like you would find in any kind of off-brand Etsy knockoff store. I know it's awful, but it's true. Um, Put that up there and say, here's what it looks like if you just auto run it and you don't do it, or if you flood fill digitize and you don't pay any attention. And here's what my version looks like done with somebody who knows how to do quality work, and show the two next to each other. If you don't have any of those examples for yourself, it's probably pretty easy to find stuff like stuff that I've done where I've talked about the quality digitizing. In fact, you've left that comment, but if you hit me up on my email, or my form, my contact me form at erichcampbell.com. I can even send you the article where I talk about high quality digitizing and why it's important. And in that article, there's examples of lettering that looks really poor, done poorly, done automatically with keyboard, and then it looks really good when somebody tuned it. Showing people the difference is the best way. The other thing I'm going to say too, learn the handshake distance. And I'm going to put that in quotes, the handshake distance. I've written multiple articles on it. So you can also search Erich Campbell, remember the funny H on Erich, and say Erich Campbell handshake distance, and learn to show them how to judge things at 3 feet. 3 to 4 feet is the average American handshake. Depending on where you're at, it might be different how close you talk. Different cultures, people talk and maintain their personal space differently. But for most of you US folks and most people in Europe, most of you are going to probably be that same distance, close to it. Depends on culturally how close talkers your folks are. I know I've been in lots of different groups of people who are their closer talkers, but none of them, not one, took a piece of embroidery or had a piece of embroidery on someone's chest and did this. Because I'm going to tell you right now, if you come up to me and lean into my chest like this, we better be really good friends. And probably more than that. Nobody's judging things at that distance. Don't have them pick it up and look at it with a microphone, a magnifying glass, microscope. Don't have them do that. 3 to 4 feet is a good way to judge that too, and have them understand that as well. So that's not a quality digitizing thing. That's a judging embroidery thing. But to the point that I have had people when they have physical shops and people are coming into their physical showrooms, I've had them make a mark on their floor 3 feet away from the wall and then clip their art to the wall and say, okay, can you see what's important? Can you read what you need to read and what looks the right way to you? And judge your own embroidery from that side too. If you're seeing a little bit of quality issues and they're not massive, you're not getting massive puckering, you don't have big gaps, you're not having bad coverage, you're just seeing a little bit of quality issues and you're worried about it, hold it out at the end of your arm first. Pretend that you have bad vision. Like some of us often do. And go ahead and reach that thing out the end of your arm and go, does it still look rough to me? Does that still look bad? Put it on the wall, tape it up, and walk back 3 feet and say, hey, judge your embroidery from handshake distance. Understand that and know that not every little moved stitch, every split in a satin, every weird little texture has to be repaired. The same people who are talking to you that are buying stuff might look at the old flood-filled chili and be like, that's fine. I like that. It's stitches. That's how often the new digitizers are. And honestly, how many times has one of you in this chat now, who's here live, looked at a piece in a commercial store? You've been doing some retail research. You're out there in a store. You look at a piece, you're turning it over, you're looking at it. And you say, man, I can't believe they let this out of this shop. I can't believe Champion would put this on a piece. I can't believe Nike would sell this hat for this much. It looks like crap. That's commercial stuff, man. That's commercial stuff that people pay more for because of the brand name that's attached to it. And unless you're seeing a mass stack of them in the clearance rack, that's stuff people are buying willingly who are not educated in the stuff that we do. Right? People are buying that because it's cute. Oh, you talked about tea towel. John R. said Wednesday at Joanne Fabrics, holiday tea towels were cringe, but they were also 15 per towel. Imagine that you too could take 50-cent towels, throw a design on them, and charge 10, 15 bucks. And now imagine if you put somebody's name on it so it's personalized. Why are you not charging enough for your work? It's personalized. It's something you can't go down and get from Joann's. Judge yourself a little less harshly. Hey, aspire to awesome quality. I want us all to make the best embroidery in the world. In fact, the best thing I think we can do as custom embroiderers is to make stuff that is better than what we see out there. Not to torture ourselves, but to aim to understand embroidery well enough that our stuff looks better than Nike on a regular basis. Our stuff looks as good or better than Super Dry on a regular basis. Why? Because then it makes our product valuable in the client's eye. If they do the thing where they pick it up and put their face to it, that they would look and go, man, that's pretty good. Like, that's tight. That looks good. Especially if they then go out and they're seeing Joanne fabric tea towels that look cringe as heck, right? Let them know. Well, that's because I am not Joanne's. I am not making this in a massive factory. I am a boutique embroiderer making this just for you. Let them know. Charge them. Anyway. All right. So glad you like it. Lisa says, this is true. Yep. Really good friends. We're having a very different conversation. Yeah, I am a married man and I don't need to have that conversation again. I already had that conversation once. So that's to say, yeah, we need to stay at that handshake distance. And yeah, we all need to hear that. Absolutely, John. You judge your own embroidery from the handshake distance. Do it and get your customers on board for sure. Don't be too hard on yourself, Carol. For real. I make mistakes too. I make stuff that doesn't work. People sometimes look at me because I'm here. I talk too much. I'm in front of you. I've shared a lot of what I've done, mostly because when I started learning, I learned all by myself and didn't have a mentor of any kind to kind of bring me through a lot of this stuff. So I wanted to be there for other people. But does that mean I am different or didn't make any mistakes? Absolutely not. Make tons of mistakes. And in fact, in the process of doing this thing right, if you don't push yourself to breaking once in a while, and I don't mean push yourself personally to breaking, if you don't take the thing that you're trying to do and try it to a level that it doesn't work, if you only ever stay within the level that works for you, you will never grow beyond that level. That doesn't mean you should be hard on yourself. That doesn't mean you should push yourself personally till you break down. But if you don't kind of test the flexibility of your skill to the breaking point once in a while, you're probably not learning as much as you could. Make something that doesn't work once in a while and then analyze why it doesn't work the way you want it to. And if you can understand the how and the why, you are so much closer to where you want to be. But let yourself do that and make it play. Play around. Play with that embroidery until it goes a little too far. I mean, treat your machines nicely. Don't break expensive equipment and don't send me the bill when you do if you do something right off the wall. Don't get so out of pocket that everything's breaking off. However, do try letters smaller than you think you can. Do try some textures that you think won't cover. Do change densities and see what real big densities or small densities look like. Try some multi-pass whip satin stitches and see what kind of textures you can get. Play with the tools. Let yourself have some time to do that. Even if you're working in a fully commercial zone, give yourself some time every week to make something for you that no one else has to see. Make sample swatches, try things out on different materials, make things that are not necessarily the most commercially viable and try it. Make some passion projects, make some art projects, have some fun and push it out a little bit further than you expect. Especially if you do it self-directed, it's not something you have to ever show another soul, but it will always be educational if you stop and think about the why and the how. All right, folks. So whether you're new, whether you've been doing this for a long time, take some time to make some time to play. Remember always, what you see on screen is never what you get. Screen lies. It does not like you. Know that continuous colored areas don't need to be a simple shape. Obviously, you can fill an area that's obviously one big slab of color with one shape in embroidery, but complicated borders, or if you want to inject more texture, you can. Remember that little line and all the little carved elements. And certainly, when brand new digitizers come to us to ask questions, remember that they're just who we were when we started and, give them a little grace too. And if you are brand new, when someone does stop to answer your question and help you and mentor you, give them a little love, give them some appreciation, because that is energy that they're spending on you for free. It is the limited amount of minutes in their lifetime, just the same as it is for you. And if they're reaching out to try and help you out, give them a little love, give them a thank you, and remember that they are spending that time to mentor you as well. All right, folks. Glad I could get back on with you. It's been a rough time, but I'm happy we got to have this time as well and to get back into the stream. And certainly have a good weekend. Take time, make time to play, enjoy yourself, and you know, can't wait to do this again next week because I can't wait to see what you'll ask and what you'll get up to as you have some fun. See you next time.